Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of chats with leading scholars in the field. With me today is Michael Herb, the Political Science Department of Georgia State University, and author of the brand new book, The Wages of Oil, Parliaments and Economic Development in Kuwait and the UAE. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I really enjoyed reading this book. I'm glad that it's out now. Could you tell us a little bit about it? What's really interesting about this book?
Well, the inspiration of the book is really the very different developmental tracks that Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates are on. I mean, these countries started off really quite, well, in a relatively similar place. They are small sheikhdoms on the Gulf under British protection. They have a whole lot of oil wealth. But, you know, Kuwait is a country in which people say very frequently that it suffers from economic stagnation, but it has the liveliest parliament, the National Assembly, the Kuwaiti National Assembly, in the Gulf, and really much livelier and much more powerful than any of the other Gulf parliaments. In the UAE, by contrast, there is a great deal of economic diversification with Dubai and the tourism industry and the airport and the container port. It's really a remarkably diverse and thriving entrepot, but very little political representation. So the book is an attempt to explain why it is that they're on different tracks and to draw some conclusions about the future of the Gulf.
So in a couple of sentences, what are the conclusions? How do you explain the difference between them?
Well, in a couple of sentences, I think the Kuwaiti National Assembly is very important. In Kuwait, the National Assembly represents the Kuwaiti middle class. The Kuwaiti middle class is largely, almost entirely, those who work for a wage, work for the state. Their paychecks come from oil revenues. A diversified economy, for example, a tourism industry, would not employ Kuwaitis and wouldn't pay taxes. And so the Kuwaiti middle class doesn't have much of an interest in that. And as a result, the National Assembly doesn't go out of its way to make it possible.
And in the UAE?
The UAE, it's in a place like Dubai, it's quite clear that the capitalist class and the political ruling elite are very closely entwined in the Emirates and especially in Dubai, and as a result, the policy reflects that. It encourages the tourism industry, it encourages the entrepot industry, or the entrepot economy, and the citizen middle class, especially the citizen, the less privileged citizen middle class in the UAE, citizens out in places like Ras Al Khaimah and Fujairah, do not have much voice in what happens in the UAE in the way that we can see that the Kuwaiti middle class has a voice through the National Assembly.
And why don't Emiratis care about that?
Well, I think Emiratis care. I spent some time in the book going back and looking at episodes from Emirati history, which would show an interest in a political system a little bit more like that in Kuwait. And in the 1970s, there was some disagreement between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And Abu Dhabi, actually, the Sheikh Zayed was advocating a change to the political system which would make it a little bit more, actually substantially more like Kuwait's. And there's a disagreement between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And it was also about strengthening the federal system, which more representation would have come along with that. And the disagreement was resolved essentially by keeping the current system. But there is evidence in Emirati history that Emiratis have thought about and there is some support at least for a different type of more citizen representation.
Well, so right now being December 2014, price of oil is collapsing. What does that do to all of this? Is the UAE system, for example, dependent upon good times? And so what happens if you get like a long-term systematic collapse in the price of oil?
These countries have a great deal of oil wealth and a lot of invested funds as well, and so there isn't going to be. I mean, they aren't going to cease to be rent-wealthy states, but they might not be able to support the level of citizen consumption through state employment that they have in the past. So Dubai has diversified its economy. It survived the economic crisis, and some of the key metrics in Dubai kept growing. Passenger traffic at the airport didn't even decline. It just kept going straight through the crisis. So the entrepot economy is thriving. Now Kuwait is a different question because Kuwait doesn't have any of that. It's entirely dependent on oil wealth. So but it also has a huge number. I mean, it's about 2/3 of the population are foreigners, and most of the private sector labor force is foreign. And so for Kuwait to make a transition away from oil, it will need to find a way to move citizens into the private sector economy in productive roles. And
this is happening at a time of one of the worst political crises in modern Kuwaiti history.
Yeah, well, Kuwait is a country with a history of political crises. It is very. I mean, one reading of it is that the opposition is out of the National Assembly at the moment, and this is the ruling family's chance to show that it can govern and to show that it can produce economic results when it has a somewhat freer hand. So.
But generally, what comes out of the book, though, is that Kuwaitis really like their National Assembly. They're proud of it.
Kuwaitis, it's an integral part of Kuwaiti national identity. It is something which is hard. It's hard to imagine Kuwait without a national assembly. It's really interesting that despite all the various sorts of crises that have been going on, the National Assembly, there's still elections, and the National Assembly is still there.
Now, you've been talking mostly, you introduced the book as a comparison between Kuwait and the UAE, but actually it's much broader than that. You're engaging with a much larger debate about the impact of oil rents, and actually the book narrows it down to this very small group of, what do you call them,
Extreme rentiers.
Extreme rentiers. So what happens when you broaden your universe a little bit? How do the implications of these cases travel to the Saudi Arabias, or for that matter, the Nigerias?
Part of the argument I make is about the rentier state literature, the rentier state literature. And this is that it is often argued that the traditional resource curse or rentier state literature has an argument that countries which have rents affect outcomes, political outcomes, economic outcomes, in largely similar ways across a wide variety of cases. I don't think that that's actually the case. I think that there are multiple causal mechanisms through which rents affect outcomes, and these vary from one case to another in ways that make it so that the appropriate methodology for studying the resource curse is to look at specific groups of cases, or even individual cases, and I look at groups of cases here, a group of cases, and see how the causal mechanisms affected by rents then produce outcomes. And we find even in Kuwait and the UAE, which are otherwise so similar, very different outcomes. But it's all, rents are, we can't say that rents aren't important. Rents have to be important in some place like the UAE and Kuwait.
And this seems to be kind of on the cutting edge of this literature now, right? Because we've moved beyond just this generic rentier effect, and you're diving deeper into those causal mechanisms, diving deeper into the local institutional context. But you don't want to throw out the entire concept of rents and their effects, of course.
Maybe the way to think about it is that we should think about the resource curse literature as identifying causal mechanisms at work in specific cases where we really understand the cases, and then come up with sort of an inventory of ways that rents can affect politics. And then when we look at, say, Trinidad, for example, which is a country which is really quite rent wealthy, or Equatorial Guinea also has a lot of per capita, is very rent wealthy. We can take some of the lessons from the Gulf and ask, well, okay, how then do we see any indications of those causal mechanisms at work? And if not, well, why not? And how might insights from the Gulf help us to understand the possible things which might have happened in Equatorial Guinea or Trinidad? But to generalize, to say that you're going to have labor market distortions in all extreme rentiers with high per capita income from rents, is probably not true.
So stay a little bit closer to home. What about, say, Qatar or Saudi Arabia?
I divide the Gulf into the Gulf GCC monarchies into essentially two groups: the extreme rentiers and then what I call the middling rentiers, based on the level of per capita rent wealth. And so in three of them, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, there is enough rent wealth, or at least up until perhaps just recently, enough rent wealth to provide essentially a job in the state at a first world standard of living to university and high school graduates, citizen graduates, of course. In Oman, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, there isn't quite that much wealth. So, and the consequence of this is that there's a much more pressing need in these societies to develop private sector jobs, productive private sector jobs for citizens.
But see, what's fascinating there is that most people wouldn't look at Saudi Arabia, you know, the heart of OPEC, as a middling rentier state.
They, but if you look at the per capita oil wealth, Saudi Arabia, you know, in absolute terms, it's of course incredibly wealthy because it has, you're dividing that rent wealth amongst so many citizens, right? So its weight in the world stage is much greater than Kuwait or the UAE or Qatar, because it's much wealthier as a whole. But per citizen, I mean, there's some parts of Saudi Arabia which aren't as well off as, say, Qatar. Just in per capita terms, it's not as much. And so because of that, they really do need to think about private sector jobs for citizens in a much more immediate way than, say, Qatar.
But it's still fascinating, though, right? Because we generally think of Saudi Arabia as the paradigm case, and I think one of the implications of the book is that it really isn't.
I think that there's different, I think that it needs to be, resource curse rentier states are different. And I think if there's a lesson from the book, I think it's one of for the political science literature on the resource curse. It's understanding how different cases are different, rather than trying to sort of lump them all together and come up with generalizations. Instead, look at specific cases and see how they work. And Saudi Arabia works differently than Qatar or Kuwait, and Bahrain. And it makes the world more complicated and harder to understand. But if we look for generalizations that apply everywhere, when there's different causal mechanisms at work everywhere, we're not gonna actually add to knowledge about the resource curse.
Well, great. Michael, thank you for joining us. We're talking about the wages of oil, parliaments and economic development in Kuwait and the UAE. And thank you for coming to GW.
Thank you for having me.